Nature's Archive Podcast, a Jumpstart Nature production.
As you all know, I find wildfire to be fascinating. It's complex, it's simultaneously necessary, and at times devastating, and it's also wildly misunderstood. And the landscape of fire is rapidly changing, literally and figuratively. So I hope to continue to bring a variety of voices and perspectives on wildfire to the podcast, including today. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be on the fire lines with a wildfire crew? Or what it takes to join a crew in the first place? Or the differences between the different types of crews that you might hear in the news, like engine crews, hand crews, and hotshots? And how do they actually manage active wildfires? Where does prescribed and cultural burning fit into the picture? So today's guest, Amanda Monthei, helps us get some answers. Amanda is a former wildland firefighter, having participated in a variety of crews, including a hotshot crew. She's now a writer and is also the host of the Life with Fire podcast, where she interviews a wide variety of people involved with wildfire. And she's also an occasional public information officer on wildfires. We discuss all of these things on today's podcast. And Amanda also graciously shares some amazing stories from her time as a firefighter. In addition to her podcast, you can find Amanda at LWF_pod on Twitter, Life with Fire podcast on Facebook, and Life with Fire pod on Instagram. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and be sure to check out the show notes on podcast.naturesarchive.com to see the video that we talked about, and also to find links to everything we discuss, including Amanda's social media accounts. So without further delay, Amanda Monthei. Amanda, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Since I started this podcast, I think when I was jotting down ideas of topics I wanted to cover, all things wildfire come to mind for me. So I'm looking forward to getting your perspective today. You have a very unique perspective on wildfire. I'm just going to jump straight in. I see in your bio that you were on a hotshot crew. So can you tell me, what is a hotshot crew and how did you find your way there?
Yeah, so I was on a hotshot crew. I was there from 2018 to 2019, so 2 seasons on the Zigzag hotshot crew up in the Mount Hood National Forest, so about an hour, southeast of Portland. And that was the result of having worked in fire for 2 seasons prior and wanting to move into that next level and see what I could accomplish at that level. It was the culmination of those 2 seasons of working in fire. On the first season, I was on an engine, and then the second season, I was on a hand crew in 2017 in central Idaho. The general trajectory for a lot of folks that get into fire are to eventually try to make it on a hotshot crew or even on a hand crew in general. This type of work is somewhat different from like your traditional engine crews. When you're on a hand crew, and hotshot crews are called type 1 hand crews, and so they're often tasked with more difficult, but type 2 hand crews can also be tasked with very difficult tasks. But generally, you think of the steepest terrain, you think of the assignments that require a significant amount of qualifications from a crew. These are qualifications that are generally required out of a hotshot crew to handle operations in the event that you need to do a burnout or you need to handle a whole section of line or something to that effect. And so you're often put into these situations where you're doing kind of the fun work of wildfires. Often, I would say probably 30% of the time, you're doing like the fun stuff, which is performing burnouts. And this is where you're like burning out the fuel between you and the fire. And so when it hits that sort of buffered line that you've created by burning out the fuel, it just drops to the ground and doesn't really have anywhere to go. Those are always fun. You're using a drip torch. You're also doing a lot of prep work to make those things happen. And so it's 2 or 3 days worth of prep work to go into like maybe a couple hours of the super fun stuff. And then you're waiting to make sure that doesn't spot across your line, whatever that might be, a road or a trail or whatever. And then you have your like hot line where you're like digging fire line, a fire break effectively right next to the fire. So you've got the fire on your face. Things are really intense. It's really exciting. It's sort of kind of work that I think people expect when they get into hot shotting, but it's not always like that. There's a lot of non-glorious work that happens too, where you're mopping up, you're ensuring that everything is cold and wet and not going to go anywhere. And you're doing that to ensure 100% containment on a fire, usually 100 feet or maybe even 200 feet in from the fire lines that have been established. So yeah, that is the very basic explanation of a hotshot crew. And it was one of the most empowering experiences of my life. And I can talk a little bit about how I got into fire, but how I got into hot shotting was just that I wanted to push it and see if I could get to that level and thrive at that level. And it felt like I could by the end of my first summer. Starting out, it was obviously very difficult, but I feel like thankfully I showed up in really good shape. And so it wasn't as physically demanding. It was more mentally and like emotionally demanding, I would say, than anything. There's a lot you can prepare for physically. You can ensure that you can meet all of or exceed all of the hotshot standards. So a certain number of push-ups, a certain number of sit-ups, a certain number of pull-ups, but you cannot really prepare for crew dynamics. You can't really prepare for like constantly doing things wrong because you're new to this type of crew that has a very specific way of doing things. And you're constantly, for the first 2 or 3 months that you're there, being told like, no, we don't do it like that here. This is how you do it. Or if you make that mistake again, you owe me 20 push-ups, or all of these things that just feel like super overwhelming when you're first starting out. And you're like, I can't remember all of these rules all at once. But then by the end of the summer, you're right in and it feels like a well-oiled machine, as they say, and you're working a lot of fire. That first season that I worked was 2018. It was a really busy fire season for almost everybody. It seemed like it was a over 1,000-hour season, as we call it. So 1,000 hours of overtime in a season is a threshold for a busy season for hotshot crews. And I think we got 1,100 or something, or maybe just over 1,000. But nonetheless, it was a very busy first season on a hotshot crew.
I'd like to learn more about how you got into fire in the first place, but sticking with this hotshot focus as our starting point. So there are so many different kinds of wildfires and different behaviors. So as you're describing the types of things that you do, like burnouts and monitoring the fire lines and things like that, I imagine that varies quite a bit depending on the behavior of a specific fire. Maybe, I don't know what's a good way to get into this, but for example, if you're going to do a burnout, you said it might take hours or days of planning to do that. So how far away from the fire line are you flanking the fire? What does a burnout look like, or burnout planning?
Oh my gosh, this is like a high level question. I almost feel like I'm unqualified to answer this. I would show up and they would be like, listen, we're going to cut all of the vegetation off of the road except the biggest trees. And then in 2 days, when we're done with that, we're going to light it. And I'm not joking when I say I rarely knew what was going on with the fire. I rarely knew what the bigger plan was. I would literally just sit in the back of the buggy and they would take me where I needed to go. And then they'd be like, okay, time to work. And then I would go to work and then I would stop when they told me to stop. And to be honest, like even to this day, I don't know exactly how those decisions are made. Often it's like you're spending those 2 days, as far as I understand, maybe you spend those 2 days clearing all that ground vegetation and low limbs off the side of the road. The fire doesn't end up coming that direction and you don't end up needing to use that line, which is effectively like a fuel break for the future. If you don't end up needing to use it for your burnout, then that's a great fuel break that the forest can be like, well, that section of road got cut out in that last fire and then the wind switched and it went somewhere else. So we know that this 2 or 3 miles of road is a fuel break for the future. And we know that we cleared that vegetation out and we might need to do it again in a couple of years. But for now, we have that and it's established. And then there might be other crews doing the same thing on other sections of line. And sometimes this happens very fast. Sometimes we don't have a lot of time to do that fuel work. Maybe we know we have a certain prevailing wind that we will expect to have for the next 2 to 3 days. And so we know eventually it's going to hit that line and we don't have any other lines between where we're at and where the fire is. So we know with a certain level of certainty that the fire is going to work its way towards this specific line or road. And maybe that road is our only fuel break potential without literally making a dozer line up and over a ridge or something in the middle. So yeah, you do your little burnout and then you have this buffer that is created even stronger by putting fire into it because it removes even more of the fuel that you can't remove by way of using chainsaws and then like carrying the fuel across the road, basically. Sometimes it's pretty urgent. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's, a contingency plan. Sometimes it's your primary plan and you've got to get moving on it. And sometimes you can't clear as much fuel as you'd like to prior to that. And the reason you're clearing that fuel is because you don't want it to get too hot during your burnout on your road, which is your fire line. And if it were to spot across the road during your burnout, then you have who knows how much land between that and your next potential line.
Right.
So then you've created a whole nother problem. And I've been on fires where that's happened, and we've spent 2 to 3 more days on the other side of the road cleaning up our mess, but done so effectively. And it's just, you're always hoping that the wind doesn't shift. And sometimes you get these like acute wind shifts that are not predicted, but are the result of whatever it might be. You might be mid-slope and you might get this push of cold air from the bottom, or of this warm air from the bottom of the valley at sunset or whatever it might be. And you're like, we did not expect that. And that's what ends up pushing things over lines and becoming problems.
That's a really good point too, because there are these like large scale weather patterns, but then when you're in the mountains and you have cool air drainages or valleys that run perpendicular to the airflow or things, like weird things happen. And that probably happens a lot more than people realize too.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
I do want to talk more about the dynamics of a wildfire fight, but let's back up and maybe you can tell me how you got into fire in the first place.
Yeah, I was really interested in, so I had a couple girlfriends actually who fought fire in like 2011 to 2014. Some of them still do work in fire. So when I saw them doing it, I was in college when they first started. There were 2 of them actually. And I think they inspired each other. Like there was one girl that got into it, and I remember being like, how did you even come up with this as an idea? Because I grew up in the Midwest, and so did these women. And we went to school in the Midwest in Michigan, at Northern Michigan University. And that's where I learned about this. And so I remember just thinking, like, how did she find this job? Because one of them was like in Alaska. Like I remember one specific photo. It was like one of her crew members was like smoking a Rolly cigarette and holding like a baby deer that he had saved from the fire. I was like, what is this? This is the weirdest, like the most bizarre thing, but like super aesthetic, right? I was just like, nobody lives like this that I know, and nobody has done this that I know. And this is just fascinating. And so after like 3 years or 4 years of watching them fighting fire all over the country, California, Alaska, Wyoming, I finally was like, I could probably actually do this. I could consider doing this. It was a mindset shift that I hadn't really experienced before, where I was, I'm allowed to think that I can do these things. I'm allowed to be like, oh, wait, if they can do it, I can do it. And then just not only think about it, but also act on it. And it was that was an informative, empowering experience for me, was just recognizing that despite my circumstances, I can go do this thing. So I did. And I signed up for some courses, which is not necessary right now, especially there's like a shortage of wildland firefighters. But at the time, it felt like getting some classes and getting some pseudo qualifications would help me get on a crew, considering I had almost no manual labor experience and I had no fire background. I didn't have my EMT. I didn't have any medical training. I was just completely green. And so I took these classes. I got on a crew that's next summer in northern Idaho. It was an engine. I didn't love the engine style of firefighting, which is that you're attached to the engine. But oftentimes on engines, you still get to go out as a hand crew. It's like a throw together crew, they call it. And they'll put you together with 19 or 20 other people from around the district who might not be full-time firefighters, but they have their firefighter qualifications, or they used to be firefighters and now they're doing something else. And you go out on these throw together hand crews, which gives you a taste of what it feels like to be on a 20-person crew, which is what a hotshot crew is. Mm-hmm. Except on a 20-person throw together, you're often not getting those intense tasks. You're doing a lot more of the mop up. Unless things are really running and gunning and they need crews to do burnouts and stuff, those crews rarely get to do like the sort of more fun stuff. Only because of a lack of qualifications often, and a lack of crew cohesion is really important in safety. When you have a hotshot crew or a type 2 crew that's worked together all season, it's a more cohesive unit. They know how they work. They know how they communicate. And on hotshot crews and on type 2 crews that are together all season, the dynamic is different. And that means that the safety standards are a little bit different. So worked on a throw together crew for a couple roles. And then I moved to central Idaho for a hand crew job. And that was a 10-person hand crew, a module, if you will, not a full 20-person hand crew. And then I just continued on, and I was really lucky to get on with Zigzag. It was like tough going to get on a hotshot crew. They hire really early in the season, and then you have to like call everybody and try to like schmooze your way onto the crew. So yeah, it worked out, and I'm really grateful it did, because that was an awesome experience.
So in terms of qualifications, like it sounds like there's some hard and fast ones, especially for a hotshot crew, and then some that are a little bit softer. Like you mentioned, there's a certain level of physical fitness required. In terms of like fire behavior, is there any requirement for specific knowledge there to join any of these crews? You mentioned hand crews, hotshot crews, etc.
Not explicitly. We sit in classes and we learn, like the firing boss class, we learn about how fire is going to interact with like certain slopes, certain topography in general, how to most effectively light a certain slope that's at a certain aspects, certain topography, certain slope types, certain fuel types. Those are all going to impact how you do firing, or they're also going to impact just like general operations, where you're going to be, where you want to be, where you don't want to be. Fire moves pretty fast uphill, so you don't really want to be above a fire that's burning below you. There are like a number of rules, your 10 and 18s, we call them, the different things that are common denominators in fatality fires have become part of the 10 and 18, like these standard orders that you don't do certain things.
And what does 10 and 18 refer to?
The 10 standard firefighting orders and then the 18 watch out situations. And I remember like doing hikes during one of my seasons in fire, not my hotshot season, but I remember hiking and they would make us recite the 10 and 18s, your 10 standard firefighting orders, your 18 watch outs. One of the watch outs is don't fight fire or don't work with a fire below you effectively. There are a number of others, keeping an eye on the weather, all of them are basically just commonalities of fatality fires from the past. So they're like lessons learned almost.
So it sounds like they teach you a lot of what you need to know to be able to understand and react and be aware of the circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. And you have like your intro to fire behavior class. That's like an essential qualification or an essential certificate that you get when you first start. So you have like your intro to like wildland firefighting, and then you have your intro to fire behavior. And then from there, your classes expand from there, whether it's into leadership classes or paperwork classes, operations classes, FEMA classes, all of these different things. And that builds your situational awareness a bit. But what really, I think, improves the qualifications of the folks that are leading hotshot crews is the experience that they have. Your captains, your superintendents, your squaddies have been working in fire for 10 years or more, sometimes 8. But nonetheless, like they've seen a lot of fire. These days, you can count on having very busy fire seasons like every other year, if not every year. And we've had a few of these like very slow years. 2019 was one. Last year was fairly slow early on. Every season, it seems like it has its like big, it wanes and waxes and all of that. And this year has been fairly slow as well. But we still have 2 months of fire season left. But yeah, so you're seeing a lot of fires, what I'm saying. Like you're on these 2-week assignments. You're on 7 or 8 of them a summer on a busy summer, and you're seeing a lot of fire behavior. And that's teaching you more than any class ever possibly could. But those classes give you the language to be able to say, oh, this is doing this on this aspect, or this is doing this in this topography. And this is what we're watching out for. And this is what I can expect from this fuel type, whether that's timber or slash or grass or brush or shrubs, whatever it might be.
That makes a lot of sense. I can only imagine, because like you hear about some of these fires on the news and you hear the location and the metrics, how many acres and how long it's been burning and percent containment and all this stuff. But those are just numbers. And I know for me, very often when I go out in a wildland of any type, whether it's forest or chaparral or whatever, I find myself stopping and looking around and thinking, if there was a 4,000 acre fire here, which is small in recent terms, like what would that look like? And how small am I compared to the immensity of 4,000 acres or 50,000 acres or something like that? So I can only imagine that all the classwork, it helps, but it can't really prepare you for when you see it. And with that in mind, do you have any particularly memorable fires or moments or scary instances or anything like that from your time on these crews?
Yeah, many. From hotshotting, I can think of a few. I was scared shitless for the first 3 months of that season. One of our first fires that season resulted in 2 of my coworkers getting hit by a widowmaker, effectively, resulting in both of them having to go to the hospital, including not only going to the hospital, but getting heli evac'd to the hospital. That we had to carry them out of this fire. With the fire still occurring, we had to carry them up this hill and get them out via helicopter. And it was really freaking spooky. I remember, now I'm an EMT. At that time, I was like a woofer, a wilderness first responder. But I remember I was working directly with the EMT on the crew at the time that it happened. And we got this radio call, and the patient, one of the sort of standard protocols when we're on fires is if you have a patient Then you need to say, like, are they a red patient, a green patient, a yellow patient, a black patient? And these all are just triage terms. And it came across as a red patient at first, which basically means like this person will die if we don't immediately get them out of here. And that's really spooky when it's somebody on your crew.
Mm-hmm.
Not only spooky, it was like terrifying. And so the EMT that I was working directly with, like we were standing across from each other, like digging out this stump hole, trying to find how it was still smoking. And he just took off and ran. And then I ran behind him and came up as he was beginning to deliver aid. And thankfully, by that point, our coworker had regained consciousness, which was the reason that they had declared him a red patient, was that he had lost consciousness and he had not yet regained it. But that moment where I thought, I'm going to watch one of my coworkers die today was like absolutely terrifying, because that happens a lot. And it happens almost like way too often from trees, very frequently from trees, very infrequently from burnovers. A lot of people think burnovers are more dangerous. Sure, they are very dangerous, absolutely, but they're not as dangerous as trees. Kind of time and time again, trees are what kill people on the line.
Are these situations where it's like a tree that you're removing or that the crew is removing to remove fuel, or is it the wind is blowing an old tree down, or what's the circumstance where trees become
Usually
dangerous?
It's fire weakened.
Okay.
Usually it's fire weakened trees that have been weakened at the base, and maybe they're trying to cut it out and the top falls out. Or in this case, a helicopter had dropped water in the area where they were working, and it had, without them realizing it, loosened up a tree branch above them of a dead tree, like a dead snag. Green trees can usually withstand burning and like helicopter drops pretty well, but dead standing snags or trees that have been weakened by fire, which is a lot of what we're working with, those are pretty weak. And so they can fall over very easily. They can lose their tops very easily. They can lose branches very easily. And you just don't know when that's going to happen. Every year we lose people to trees. And I really thought that day that we were going to lose one of my coworkers to a tree. And then we very gratefully didn't. But that sort of set the stage for that summer, because that was May. We were in New Mexico. We had just started the season. You go to the Southwest at the beginning of the season. There's a general timeline for a hotshot season, especially. You start out the season with prescribed burning in your region. So usually for us, that was Oregon or Washington. And then you go to the Southwest for a couple weeks, and then you go to Utah for a couple weeks, and then you go back up to the Northwest for a couple weeks, and then maybe you go to California. There's a very clear timeline for when places burn. So we were only in the Southwest. We were at the very beginning of the season.
And I guess that makes sense too, because I'm just thinking about weather patterns, and the beginning of the year, it gets very dry, very hot quickly in the Southwest. And then hopefully at some point the monsoon season kicks in, and you might have some lightning strikes at first, but then it gets wet. And then about that time, as you move further northwest, it's dry. It's been dry for longer. And the fire behavior starts to creep its way up. You mentioned you had a couple different, or several anyway, different stories. So what else comes to mind as particularly memorable moments?
Yeah, one in terms of like ecology and not in terms of being afraid or anything to that effect. From an ecological standpoint, I remember being in Wyoming in 2018, again, that busy season. And we were there in October. And I believe it was like October 8th or 9th. We were on this like little fire that had been started by some hunters because it was hunting season. And in October, you can expect that like you're going to be getting snow or sleet or some sort of precipitation up high. And we were in the high country. We were like at 8,000 or 9,000 feet in this canyon in Wyoming. And I just remember we were working on this fire, and we ended up doing like a pretty wild little burnout in order to keep it from progressing further down the ridge line that we were working on. And that was exciting and fun, and we succeeded, whatever. But then the next day the fire started moving in the other direction, and there was this wind that got on it, and it just picked up and moved like you would not believe. Like this thing that had been smoldering, kind of like fiddle farting around for a couple of days. Like we had done some good work on it like the day or two prior, but we were like, okay, cool. We did our big burnout and like things are settling down. And then the next day some wind got on it. And so what had been smoldering became like trees torching, insane fire behavior like I have never seen before. Like just watching entire acres burn in like minutes and watching it right in front of me and being like a quarter mile away and still feeling really intense heat, so much so that I like had to turn. I mean, I should have been turned around anyway. Like people in fire would be like, why were you watching the fire? Because in that case, I should have been watching what they call the green to make sure that nothing was igniting on the side of the line that you didn't want it to be igniting on. But this thing was like such a force of nature. I couldn't help but be looking at it because it was just something that you just can't help but watch because it was just nuking off acres of land of subalpine fir in minutes. And it was just the hottest fire I'd ever been on. Like I said, I was like pretty far away and I was feeling the heat on my face to the point where I needed to turn around and cover up my neck. So I wasn't like feeling it burning. And yeah, that was wild. And it settled right down it was like an hour where we had this crazy wind come in. We didn't even expect a cold front or anything. I don't remember, but I think it came kind of out of nowhere. And I have some video from it, actually. I was just taking video of the fire burning, but then it started crossing the line as I was taking video. And I was like, and it became super smoky and there were embers falling all around us. And I turned the video off pretty quickly, obviously. And we started chasing all these embers. But I did get this 7-second video where you could see the wind shift and suddenly we were engulfed in smoke and there was literally embers flying around us. And it happened so fast. Not only was the wind on it, but then the wind was swirly. The wind was swirling around and it was okay, everything's pulling in. Everything's doing exactly what we want it to do. It's burning pretty intense, but we're seeing it moving in towards itself. The smoke isn't coming at us. That's always a good sign. And then the smoke suddenly shifted and it was coming directly at us. And we were like, that's not what you want.
That video, is that something I could link to in the show notes?
Nowhere online. And it's a chaotic, as you can imagine. I didn't even realize I was continuing to record. And so you can tell that because my phone is doing this. But yeah, I can send that over.
Yeah, that might help give a little perspective. And I can only imagine too, because you're talking you set the scene, you're subalpine in Wyoming in October. You're feeling okay, this is season is winding down. We did our part. All's good here. And then suddenly
exactly
nature has another idea in mind.
You're exactly right. That part of the season, sorry to interrupt you, but in that part of the season, you're expecting, we call it Snaptember because not only does the weather usually snap in September where you're okay, cool, we're getting rain, but also people start to snap a little bit. Everyone's pretty annoyed with everybody. So usually Snaptember is your standard. And then in the last 5 seasons, I would say that has not been the case. I would say people are still actively doing the kind of firefighting that you would expect out of August in September. And so to have that intensive fire behavior in October, and not only that, but we had gotten hailed on that week. I remember everybody was sleeping outside of their tents because we don't usually set tents up unless it's going to be raining or it's really buggy or something. So everybody was we're not going to set tents up. And then we all got hailed on one night and we kept waking up with the frostiest boots. It was cold at night and it was precipitating, but not quite in the ways that we needed. Hail, not super effective, but then we were getting this insane fire behavior from 2 to 6 every day. It was wild.
You're talking a little bit about fire behavior changing and snap timber not really being a thing in recent years. I hear this commentary a lot. Wildfire behavior is changing rapidly and for lots of different reasons. And I'm curious, do you have other perspectives on that? Being around people who have been doing this for years and years in your own personal experience, is it accurate to say that, yeah, fire weather, fire behavior is just totally different than it was, say, a decade ago? Hey, nature enthusiast, do you want to be part of something bigger? Well, we're building a movement at Jumpstart Nature, and we've just added some new volunteers to help with our podcast and website. But this means our costs are going up too. I need to purchase software licenses to give them access to the production tools we use. For example, one media editing license costs $21 a month. And this is where you come in. Please consider supporting our mission by contributing to Jumpstart Nature through our Patreon or direct contributions, or even purchasing some logo merch. Check out all these options at jumpstartnature.com/donate, also linked in the show notes. Not ready to make a financial contribution? Then please share this episode with 3 friends. Sharing what we do is actually one of the very best ways you can help us. Thank you all for your continued support.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's apt that you say a decade ago because I think a lot of people are 30, 40 years ago, it was way different back then. And that is true. But you can go only back to 2012, 2013 and see how much things have changed even since then. Things are changing really rapidly for a number of reasons. Climate change absolutely is a contributing factor. land management policies over the last 130 years are obviously a factor. But yeah, I mean, like the fires that the veteran folks who are maybe retired now, but they are still on like Facebook talking about the fires that they fought in the 70s and 80s. Those folks were seeing like one or two of the types of fires that I saw in 2018 all summer. So they're seeing one or two of these big fires, and they're maybe amazed by a 50,000 acre fire, or maybe super amazed by a 100,000 acre fire. The Yellowstone fires in 1988 were like an unprecedented event. And I don't remember the acreage on that fire, but we're getting fires like that are burning at that severity and at that size and at that previously unprecedented level. We're getting those many times a summer now. And the intensity is increased not only because we have more rapid drying of fuels, we have a propensity towards drought or towards really extreme weather patterns because of climate change. There's a number of contributing factors there, but then also we have the really high quality suppression work that folks were doing in the 60s through the 90s and earlier than that and later than that, obviously, too. But we're really good at suppression for a really long time. And that has resulted in fuel buildup that is almost impossible to manage beyond burning it at this point. And people have long recognized that the only way we're going to manage the land at a landscape level is by burning it. But now with that fuel loading, it's a lot more likely for those fires to burn at a severity that maybe wasn't historically what they wouldn't have expected historically in those areas.
So what you're describing is you have more fuel, and now you're amplifying that with more intense weather, hotter, a little bit windier. And then, yeah, it's a recipe for a much more challenging problem to dig ourselves out of.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, because our traditional tools for this were thinning and prescribed burns. Those are still our traditional tools, what we're using, what we can use. But it's much harder to use prescribed fire in places that have that intense fuel loading. And it's pretty hard to get in there and thin all that stuff out when you're talking however many trees per acre, 80, 90, 100 trees per acre, super dense woods, forests, and getting in there and mechanically thinning that or thinning that by hand is a lot of work. And then burning it without thinning it is a recipe for just burning it really intensely and maybe losing all of your mature trees. And you don't want that either, really. And so there's this bind that a lot of land managers are in where they're like, yes, we recognize the need for better management, but who wants to go into these dense fuel loads and put fire in them? And also, who has the resources to go in and thin all of these acres that we need to burn? I mean, we have millions and millions and millions of acres that need this management. And there's just not a lot of resources and not a lot of money that's going towards burning at the landscape or managing at that landscape scale.
You start to do the math on that too. And you figure like, I'll have to see if I can find this reporting. I saw it a couple years ago during one of the really intense California seasons. And it was looking at what would it take to go manually thin California's forests they reduced it to like forests that hadn't seen fire in the last 20 years or something like that. So they were already reducing it to not recently burned. And then the number of acres, and then trying to take into account the topography and the terrain and the difficulties there. And then how many people and how much time and would it take? And it was just phenomenal numbers. Like it was an army of people working for years to be able to get there. It's mind boggling. It's easy to say, yeah, just go thin it, but it's mind boggling when you actually consider the numbers.
Absolutely. And then once you finish thinning it that 1 year, you might be able to get some fire in there, but that area is going to need to be managed again if it doesn't see fire in its traditional fire regime. So that might be 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years, whatever it might be, but you're going to need to go back in there and do that work again because you're going to have more fuel grow. You're going to have more trees fall. You're going to have all this additional fuel stacking up over those. As soon as you're done managing it, as soon as you're done and getting in there and thinning it, it's going to keep growing. Yeah. So it's it's a cyclical problem that like we can put all this money towards it right now, but then in 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to have to do it again in certain areas. And so It's not insurmountable. It's like maybe a little naive to say. I would say like one of the things we or like the Forest Service, land managers in general have been talking about more is managing fire for ecosystem benefit or using fire for ecosystem benefit. And that is effectively allowing some fires to burn a certain amount of acreage in certain amounts or certain times of the year when you have precipitation coming, or you maybe just had a big rainstorm. And so the fuels are significantly less dry. So when you have like access and resource availability and temperature and weather that all align, and you have a natural ignition of a wildfire, I think more managers are considering like, okay, maybe this can be a way that we can gain some of that acreage. We can maybe allow this thing to have a small footprint on the landscape. We can have resources assigned to it in the event that it gets into any areas that we don't want it to get into. I have worked on fires like this where we were effectively tasked with protecting a few campsites, a few archaeological sites, and a lookout. We were like in the middle of nowhere, but those were the things that we were tasked with protecting. So we were like letting this thing burn. Like, I don't like to use that language because we had the resources in place to stop it at any moment that we needed to. We had a helicopter assigned to the fire. We had a crew. I think we had 30 or 40 people assigned to this 1,000-acre fire, pretty small in the grand scheme of things. And especially so, it was in grass and like very sparse timber. So nonetheless, we lit burnouts above the campgrounds. When the fire would creep into the drainages above them, we would just light below them and like burn out all that fuel so it didn't have a way to get down to the campsite. And then same thing would happen on the next drainage. And it was like fairly straightforward, didn't take a lot of resources, didn't get out of control at any point. We just watched it and made sure that it wasn't going anywhere that we didn't want it to go. So these types of fires can be one of the answers to increasing our ability to get acreage of fire on the ground, because getting a 200-acre prescribed fire initiated and implemented is incredibly difficult with the amount of procedures that you have to go through, processes, permitting, air quality standards, burn plans, getting the resources, making sure you have the right weather window, ensuring that weather window stays in place as you plan it and you get your resources on their way. There's a lot of logistics that go into creating a prescribed burn, and that can only be 200 acres or maybe 1,000 acres or maybe 2,000 if you're very, very lucky.
For people who have not actually witnessed wildland fire, and we always have the challenge that, as we alluded to at different points here in our discussion, all fires are different and all landscapes are different. And if you're burning in chaparral or oak woodland or coniferous forest or whatever the case might be, things are going to be different. So I'm just going to throw that out as a huge caveat to what we talk about. But there's this concept that I hear a lot of pyrodiversity. Can you tell me what is pyrodiversity and like what does it look like to somebody on the ground?
Pyrodiversity is this idea where you need a certain amount of heterogeneity on a landscape. And that heterogeneity a lot of the time is encouraged by the way that fire burns differently in certain areas of a landscape. So some slopes might not see as intensive fire effects as other slopes. And that creates a mosaic pattern on the landscape, they call it. You have some areas that burned at a really high severity. You have some areas that burned almost at no severity whatsoever, maybe didn't burn at all. Maybe that fire only burned the ground fuels and maybe a little bit of the tree limbs. And then in some areas, you're going to have fires that burn off the crowns of trees. They're going to maybe burn trees to a crisp. And traditionally, historically, that has all been pretty standard, pretty commonplace. And you want to see that kind of biodiversity because it encourages these different age classes of different types of trees and different tree species. You don't want a landscape that looks like one tree species of the same exact age as far as the eye can see. And I was actually in a landscape like that last week where a fire had burned at a very high intensity across this entire watershed almost. Like we were at the headwaters of this watershed, and for as far as the eye could see, it was just a blanket of lodgepole thicket. And there's a lot of history in that area. There was a history of logging prior to this fire. The fire had burned in 1996. And what it had left were standing snags, these big, huge standing snags, and a sea of thicket, a sea of lodgepole that was the same age class. So that's not what you want to see. It looks like a tree farm. What you want to see are varying age classes. You want to see some of that old growth. You want to see maybe a little bit of that new growth. You also want to see areas that were impacted by high severity fires so that you get a few spaces where new trees can come in and new species maybe can come in. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you want to have these kind of refugia that are left behind that didn't burn, and it's a foothold, a toehold for recovery. And then there's succession from some of the wildfire adapted plants that need the fire, need to come in afterwards. So you have this mix. And I'm thinking to your comment earlier, you were mentioning mismanaged land. And yes, some of that may be having not let fire burn and having suppressed fire. But I can recall several instances where logging had occurred and then, homogeneous stands of singular trees for the purposes of timber farming were put in. And I guess to me, you're connecting some dots for me as I think out loud here with this question. And that's once we alter the landscape to be homogeneous, it's going to take some effort and time to get back to this more diverse, fire adapted ecosystem that maybe existed 200 years ago, for example.
Yeah, totally. Logging is a massive part of this. And some of the most fire adapted landscapes you can have are old growth forests. And we don't have many of those anymore. And a lot of them were replaced with tree farms, effectively, with an area that was effectively clear cut, maybe in the 60s or 70s or 80s or earlier, and then seeded and planted. And maybe we have better strategies for this now, but for a while there, we didn't. We were just clear cutting stuff and then planting or not and allowing whatever wanted to come back. And that resulted in these homogeneous stands that are incredibly not fire adapted. And you would expect that because fire adaptation, I think, is hand in hand with biodiversity, with this diversity of species, with this diversity of age classes. But nonetheless, like the basis of that forest ecology piece of this is that you do want these different age classes. You want things to be heterogeneous. There we go. And you want the fire to interact with the landscape differently across the landscape, across entire swaths. You don't want things to just entirely nuke off. Not really ideal in most ecosystems.
Right. And I want to get back to prescribed burning too. We were chatting as an aside a little bit ago about some of the challenges of prescribed burning and how so much has to be just right. Can you walk me through what does need to be in place in order to actually have a prescribed burn?
Yeah, prescribed burns can take years to implement. And that is usually a result of, creating a burn plan, getting permitting from NEPA effectively for air quality impacts. So you have to get these approvals and it can take years to get those approvals. We will be impacting air quality on this during this season at some point when we have a weather window. And this is how many acres we're going to burn. And this is what we expect to be the air quality. This is what we are looking for prevailing winds that day so that we can push all that stuff out of major populated areas. So all of these things require a lot of time, red tape, classic bureaucracy, but for good reason also. Those air quality standards are in place for a reason, and that's to protect vulnerable populations and people in general from these asthma flare-ups or from not being able to leave their house. So you have to get that NEPA permitting. You have to have a burn plan in place. You have to have the right resources in place. You have to wait for that weather window, and that can take a pretty long time. You can maybe wait for a weather window all season and never get it. You also have to prepare the unit. So you have to go in there, mechanically thin what you can so that you're not going to have fire behavior beyond what you want it to be. So if you don't want to have any high severity impacts in your burn unit, then going in and mechanically thinning is going to be the way that you maybe prevent that from happening. Some areas, maybe you don't mechanically thin and then you're like, okay, that's fine if that burns really intense in there. Or maybe you don't mechanically thin it at all and you're just hoping to see those types of impacts. There's a lot that goes into it. It can take a while. It can take years. And that makes it quite difficult to implement a lot of these things at scale across not only California, but across the West.
And are you, this may seem like a random question, but have you heard of the trolley problem? It's like a standard ethics question that people sometimes have.
Yeah.
I think of prescribed burns like a trolley problem in a way, because for those that don't know the trolley problem, it's morbid, unfortunately, but it gets at the heart of an ethical decision. And that's you're standing on a trolley track and you have a choice. You can fling a switch and have a trolley go down one path or another path. Or you could do nothing. You could just let it go. And if you let it go, the trolley is going to hit 5 people and maybe kill 5 people. But if you flip the switch, then it's only going to hit 3 people. And then the question is, would you rather flip the switch? And then at that point, you are responsible for killing the 3 people. Whereas if you let it go, it kills 5 people, and you can claim or convince yourself you're not responsible because it was already going that way. And that's the essence of the trolley problem. I think of that with prescribed burns because we're dealing with really hard trade-offs so often with prescribed burns. That smoke is going to come sooner or later, whether it's under your control or not. That fire is going to come sooner or later. It really is an interesting and a challenging problem when you have politicians, the public, and the people who need to do the work all coming together for this ethical problem.
Yeah, you're totally right. And that's a fantastic analogy, actually, I would say, because that's a conversation that everyone's always having. Prescribed fire smoke is less noxious than wildfire smoke. It's also easier to manage how it dissipates into the atmosphere because you can choose what days that you burn. And so you can choose those days where the prevailing winds are pushing it out into the wilderness where nobody's going to notice it, or where it's pushing it, it's bringing it aloft so that it's a lot less noticeable to folks on the ground. And then wildfire smoke it's going to be pretty intense, and it's going to be pretty intense for days, if not weeks. Another piece of this is, are wildfires natural anymore? Can we even consider them natural? I talked to somebody on the podcast, I don't remember their name, who brought up this point of we can't really consider wildfires to be natural at this point because of all of the human actions that have resulted in them behaving the way that they are. So that management piece, the anthropogenic climate change piece. So skirting responsibility for the ways that fires burn now is like very misleading because it's very much on us. But it's still easy for people to be like, this is natural, this is an act of God. And it's gotten to the point where it's not. I think it's definitively not an act of God anymore. This is every time we see one of these intense wildfires. Lahaina is a great example. Not an act of God. That was an act of many things going wrong across 100 to 200 years, from colonization to the planting of non-invasive or non-native grasses to a number of other ingredients there.
Oh, yeah. And you can look at the history in California as a really good example. So many wildfire starts are directly attributed to power infrastructure, for example. It's not lightning. It's not like a random rock causing a spark when it fell down a cliffside or something. So given the challenges that we do have with prescribed burning and all the variables that go into that, do you see the landscape improving? Do you see more willingness to pursue prescribed burning as one of the tools in our toolkit?
Yeah, there's a massive movement to increase our ability to implement more fire on the landscape right now. Absolutely. And I'm seeing some pretty cool initiatives happening with collaborations between the Forest Service and local organizations. One of them, I just talked to the forest supervisor and the Stanislaus National Forest. That episode will be up on my podcast in a couple of weeks. But he was talking to me about getting approval for larger swaths of land for various management activities. In his case, I think he got approval for like 100,000 acres. And they were like, do what you want with it over this period of time. And so he got approval to treat, in effect, 100,000 acres, if not tens of thousands. Yeah. It's a big chunk. And that's what I'm talking about when I say landscape scale, is these chunks where we can maybe do 4,000 acres at a time or 6,000 acres at a time, in doing so on this plan of treating that big number over the course of 2, 3, 4 years. So that's what I see as being a very effective strategy moving forward, is just anything we can do to get more landscape scale treatment on the land, whether that is thinning and burning, or just thinning or just burning, or whatever combinations we can create with those approvals that these forests can get. I think that's a big move forward. And other than that, I think continuing to manage certain fires for ecological benefit, for the benefit of the landscape, in cases where you can do that, where it's maybe pretty far away from homes and infrastructure, where that landscape needs fire, where the weather patterns coming up are conducive to you allowing things to kind of operate as they would have historically. Those are all opportunities for more fire on the landscape. And we got to take those opportunities when we can.
Yeah, and that's actually a good tie-in. And I know we're a little short on time, but to the ecological benefit of fires, some of the prescribed burning that we do, because there has to be a certain humidity level and maybe a recent rain and the weather has to be just right, the prescribed burns may occur at a time of the year that is not when some of the plant communities are actually adapted to have fire. in the first place. So they aren't quite as effective necessarily from an ecological standpoint. So I like that you bring that up, letting some of those, when they're in places where they can burn, letting them burn seems to be important. And the other thing I want to throw out real quick is I'm sure there are listeners right now saying, you haven't talked about indigenous burning and traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people.
Yeah, that is a critical piece of all of this. And I apologize for not having brought it up earlier. Prescribed fire is, in essence, what we can do as land managers to replicate the history of cultural burning on the landscape. And a lot of tribes in the West have used cultural burning for a long time. I say have used because they are still currently using cultural fire in many landscapes. I would say that the sort of preeminent example here is the Yurok tribe in Northern California. There are a number of other tribes, though, that use fire to this day. And for a long time, it was outright outlawed and it was not allowed on the landscape. We are the land managers of the early 1900s. They were protecting timber stands. That was a highly valuable product, and it still is. They were protecting homes. That was the sort of pretense under which they disallowed cultural burning.
It had and I hate to say it, but it's true, it had the side effect of really hurting the indigenous people too.
Absolutely. It was, by and large, probably the very first step in removing fire from the landscape in this whole history of suppression that we have. The first step was removing indigenous people from the land, and therefore removing those processes and that very essential stewardship that they were doing for thousands of years on the landscape, and the critical traditional knowledge that they had of that landscape and how those processes affected the landscape. That was all removed with the removal of indigenous people, with the murder in many cases of indigenous people. And so we lost all of that traditional knowledge. We lost a lot of that. And when I say lost, I don't mean that we lost it definitively. I think that we are returning to a place where that knowledge base has so much value in current land management conversations. And it should have had that value this whole time. But for 80, 100, 150 years there, we lost touch with those stewardship practices that had made the landscape that we so loved. And so when you have John Muir coming in here and espousing and waxing poetic about how amazing the landscape is and how he wants to create, how we need wilderness areas and how all of this is on the backs of the indigenous people who stewarded that land and made it what it was when pioneers and colonizers came to the West and saw this amazing landscape that they wanted to then protect. And so we still are living with this sort of understory, or this like underbelly of thinking that wilderness areas are the way that they are just by nature of being wild, when in fact humans have been wrapped up in the ways that these landscapes look for thousands of years. And the reasons that those areas are now burning off is because we removed the original stewards of that land in the early 1900s. That's my spiel. I have a real sort of soapbox about wilderness areas and how we think that wilderness is this bastion of what we should be aspiring to. I think in reality, it's a colonial complex. And I think that being a part of the landscape and stewarding it actively and managing it actively at this point especially is an essential part of making those places remain as cool as they are. And I'm talking about places like Yosemite. I'm talking about the giant sequoias. Those areas were stewarded over thousands of years by indigenous people. And therefore now they're burning at a higher intensity because you have more of this underbrush. You have more fuel loading in areas that would have traditionally not had a lot of fuel loading because there would have been a very consistent presence of fire in those places. So there's a lot I could say about that. That's the basic.
Yeah, the whole communities would be different too. The plant communities would be different if there had been continual burning over time. So yeah, it's a very complex topic. And I'm working on having an episode dedicated to this topic in the future. I don't have anything that I
hope you do
point to and say it's definitely on the schedule, but I have a few conversations going and I'm hoping to make it work sooner rather than later. And if anyone out there listening says, hey, I know someone that you can talk to, please let me know. That might speed this up a little bit. The other thing I just feel obligated to do, because one of the things I strive to do here and with Jumpstart Nature is get into the nuance of the discussions. And this wilderness concept that you mentioned, I think is a really good example of the false pretense of all or nothing. Like wilderness, I think from the European mindset is like an untouched land. And there's really no land that is untouched. Now, on the flip side of that, I also hear arguments related to traditional cultural burning and saying that this traditional burning never touched every acre of land. That's also true. There are certain areas that weren't touched. Both things can be true. I just want to say that at the same time.
Yeah. I would say, though, that lightning probably still touched those areas.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And they would have been allowed to burn, not only because Indigenous people would have allowed them to burn, but also because in many cases they would have been so far away that there wouldn't have been a need. Right. And like, obviously their communities weren't as sprawling as ours are.
Absolutely. So if you could snap your fingers and maybe resolve a common myth or misunderstanding with wildfire that you see the public having, what would that be?
I would say conflating all wildfires as equally tragic or catastrophic. There's a lot of cases where I see people talking about a fire burning in a landscape where it's like threatening infrastructure, but maybe it's also just not threatening anything. It's just out in the wilderness, but it's an area that people love and have a special place in their heart for. And I see in the comments consistently, this is so sad. And I'm so bummed that this area is burning. Like, I loved that area. They speak about it as if this is not part of the natural process. So I think for so long, we have accepted that fire not being in the landscape is the norm. And we've accepted that smoke not being in the air is norm. That now our baseline is that none of these things are normal and everything is a result of us screwing everything up, and that every single fire is equally catastrophic, when in reality, many of these places and many of these fires you don't even hear about. They're like out in the middle of national forests and have no impact on anybody. Maybe you get a little smoke in town. And then you have your Lahaina's and you have your Paradise and you have your Marshall Fire and you have these insanely catastrophic, absolutely tragic wildfires. And I just worry about people not thinking more objectively about the fires that happen out in the national forest. And I think a lot of people have good enough sense to understand that these are not the same thing, but I just would like maybe a little more understanding of like how fire can benefit the landscape and how it's not sad when fire comes into these places that we love. Like, it's not sad. It might change. You might see some fire scarred trees, or you might see some trees that were completely burned over, but it's not going to fundamentally change that landscape to the extent that you think it will. And in fact, it's probably beneficial that it's seeing that fire. So that's my little soapbox on that, I would say.
Where can people go to learn more about wildfire in any of the aspects that we've talked about, whether it's fighting it or supporting it or prescribed burning? Do you have any recommended resources? And actually, I'm going to interrupt you before you even answer. You have your podcast that we've talked about a little bit here.
Yeah.
And I would recommend people start with that. So why don't you plug your podcast? And if you have other resources, I'm all ears.
Yeah. So my podcast is called Life with Fire Podcast. I talk to experts and practitioners, cultural fire practitioners, firefighters, land managers, all sorts of folks about our relationship with wildfire. Very generally, I get to explore pretty much any topic I feel like, whatever interests me that week, whether that's communicating about wildfire or really nitty-gritty fire ecology stuff. And I'm often talking with academics and people who can provide a lot more context and nuance than I possibly ever could with my English writing degree. That's called Life with Fire Podcast. You can find it on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. I would also highly recommend Good Fire Podcast if you're interested in cultural fire and the history of cultural fire across the world. I would recommend High Country News for wildfire reporting. Kylie Moore is a wildfire reporter for them, and she does really good work, and it's highly nuanced, and she really nails it, I would say. And yeah, otherwise, I think if you just follow a few folks on Twitter who have wildfire in their bio, you'll probably find a lot more resources. So anyway, yeah, there's so many.
And speaking of Twitter, social media, can people follow you online?
Yep, absolutely. And I share a lot of what those folks are saying pretty often. There's just a lot of really smart people working in this, and it's been really fun to learn from them. And everything I know is from these practitioners and GIS folks and former wildland firefighters and cultural fire practitioners. Like, I'm learning so much from this community, and it's awesome.
I'm looking forward to listening to the Good Fire podcast. That's one that has not crossed my radar.
Very good.
So before we wrap it up for today, is there anything else that you'd like to say? Any big misses, any topics that you're like, oh, we should have covered that? Maybe we can just have you back sometime too.
Yeah, because like secession is like very interesting to me. Like, I could talk more about the wilderness concept. Like, there's so much fun nuance here that is fun for lack of a better word, to dig into. And I know I talked really long on some of those answers, so I apologize. I just get really excited.
I'm sure the excitement will shine through in the episode. So Amanda, thank you again for taking the time to do this, sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and all the things you picked up through these various ways that you work with fire directly and the people who interact with it too. I appreciate you and your time.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Sounds great. Thanks for sticking through the entire episode. If you made it this far, I hope that it means that you enjoyed it. If so, please spread the word and share this episode with 3 friends or groups that you think would enjoy it too. As for today's episode, let me know. Did I miss anything? Was there a topic I should have covered? Let me know at podcast@jumpstartnature.com or DM me on any of my social accounts. I'll do my best to answer your questions. You can find me at Nature's Archive, one word, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I also share photography, nature stories, and much more on those accounts, so you can follow just to stay in touch, too. And despite being called crazy by numerous friends and colleagues, last year I left my tech career behind to start Jumpstart Nature, which Nature's Archive is now part of. For the sake of myself, my family, and the planet, I need to make this work. So please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/jumpstartnature. I offer some exclusive content and perks, and you can start donations as low as $4 a month. Lastly, please also check out our latest creation. It's the Jumpstart Nature podcast. We just completed our pilot season, where each episode reveals an unseen, surprising, or misunderstood nature topic with the help of experts and our host, Griff Griffith. It's entertaining and inspiring, and even reached number 3 on the Apple Nature podcast charts. There's much more on our roadmap, but we need your support, so check out jumpstartnature.com for more details. Thank you.